obviously they're very interrelated. They're both focused on the subject of hope. But the first one, Waiting at the Foot of the Cross, the dissertation one, is much more critiquing the way that the West and North America has implicitly understood hope as kind of mastery over chance, mastery over making things happen the way we want them to happen, and having goals that we reach and bring to completion. But while I was working on my dissertation, I was also serving in spiritual care, in palliative care, in pediatric trauma, and so here I was writing and thinking about these big picture ideas about hope when I was walking with people who were facing endings and facing their own death, facing just the utter devastation of their lives and their families' lives. Yet sometimes, and there's nothing inevitable about this, but sometimes in the midst of these terrible, tragic situations, there was this sense that hope was present there in a kind of mysterious way that unhinged anybody's expectations of what would be normative in that kind of context. In the case of a young boy dying tragically of a brain tumor, only child. Other situations where sudden violent death, and somehow there would be this sense of hope there, or walking with people in palliative care who were wrestling through all of what their life and their dying meant for them at that time. And so I found I was thinking about these big ideas, but then here I was having these conversations, hearing people who were just bearing witness to hope being quite something a lot bigger and more mysterious in some sense, but also in a very hidden way, in a way that I wouldn't have anticipated. So it was sort of these two things going on at once. So that's what really compelled me to write the second book, because it really brings, it challenges some of the things in the first book, but it also really brings it down to earth in terms of the lived human experience and the kinds of things that we all face, right? As we all die, and sometimes it's got more tragic ending than others, or some of us living in the midst of terrible violence, and how do we live within that? So hope in the inclusive sense would include this shift from a more narrow, isolated place to a larger vista. So discovered oneself, one's circumstances, to be embedded within a much larger narrative reality that gives the immediate meaning and gives a sense of locatedness within something much bigger. The issue with if we think about despair or some of those, it's this closing off, this isolation, disconnecting, being disconnected from life, from relationship, from the larger cosmos, from God, and so the shift toward hope is when there are intimations of that opening up to something larger, and I use the language of a larger horizon of meaning. My life has meaning in a larger sense than I would have known before, and discovering oneself almost to be participating in this larger reality that was shut off from me before. And it's something that we all know, but it's also something that is so powerful in that being present in the midst of isolating, devastating experiences. A lot of people just want to run away, right? So what does it mean to be present and with another in the face of devastating loss? So that would be one way I would want to talk about hope, the care that embodies hope, would be that presence piece. But it's also making the connections with the larger, prayer very much does that, can do that. Hope is one of these things that is, it's almost like as soon as you want to grab hold of it and say this is what it is, it changes. So there's something about, we always point toward hope. It's like God. We always point toward God. We can never fully grasp what it is, the fullness of God. And hope, and any true hope is of God, right? So there is this quality about hope that always transcends however we want to talk about it, and sort of jumps away the minute we try to grab hold of it like that. At the same time, it's deeply important, I think, for us to be mindful of all the ways in our lives where hope may be present. Like I was just thinking of one of the stories in the second book. It's the story of the young boy dying, and that reflecting on hope as meaning. That was sort of the focus in that chapter after telling the story, because it was a very, very tragic story. Yet the way the mother, and I'm not trying to pretty things up, and that's part of the problem. Sometimes Christians have been noted for trying to make things nice and happy, because we have to, and I think the cross really invites us, to go to those really dark places and trust that actually in some way hidden hope at least can be found there, touched there. And so in the case of this young boy, I worked a lot with the mother through that time, and for her, I just kept seeing it, like she was wrestling meaning out of this. Like how could she bear witness to the meaningfulness of the life that her son had lived? But I think, you see what I saw, and I don't want to suggest that suffering is meaningful in and of itself. And that's what I wanted to make that distinction in this case, because there was such a pull toward meaninglessness. The meaninglessness of a 6-year-old dying of a brain tumor, only son, most beloved, just made all the difference in the world to his mom, her life, her everything. So I don't want to, the pull was to meaninglessness, to just, this means nothing, right? And her resistance to that, and drawing out the sense of this person, as young as his time was, he changed me. He changed me for the better. This little boy of mine, like, how do I hold up the distinctiveness of who he was, the God-given beauty of who he was? And so all these different, she did all these symbolic things. It's almost like it was just this need to it. Doesn't mean she didn't struggle. She really struggled at points with, what if he's just dead in the ground, right? And then she'd have this vision of him with God and with her father, in light, in heaven. In some ways, God became the intermediary in the way she was able to connect with her son. But so organ donation for her, giving all his organs away. She became very clear that she needed to do this because his life needed to be meaningful, and did. It impacted 6 other people's lives. It changed their lives. And so this isn't to say somehow the suffering in itself was meaningful, but she wrestled out meaning and stood by it, through that her son's life had meaning. Not so much, it wasn't so much highlighting his death as trying to draw forth the resonances of his life for others. So for me, as a person of faith, always the question of hope is a question of how do we recognize God's presence and invitation in even the most utterly devastating moments of life, right? And mostly God's presence. So for me, hope and God's presence are there, like right together. The book, the way I've just described in a lot of ways, people who are not people of faith may not make the connection that this is about God's presence. But I would want to say that anytime, some of these things, God's presence is there, and hope always speaks, I think, to that reality when it is experienced in human relationships and human life. But that's the quick equation in terms of hope and the divine presence in life. And I think so often we think of God so far away and not living in the midst of the wear and tear of everyday life. And I think, Jesus' story invites us to really take a second